And welcome back. Racism in the United States was at its worst during the 20th century, worse than any other period in American history. African Americans lost many civil rights gained during the Reconstruction era. Anti-Black violence, lynchings, segregation, legal and racial discrimination, and expressions of white supremacy have increased. Our first guest is an author of the book, The 20th Century Civil Rights Movement and Africana Studies Perspectives. The book is based on engagement with sources and writers who experienced working and interacting with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and other key actors in the civil rights movement. Joining us now to provide their point of view on this matter, I'm joined by the professor of the Department of Africana Studies at Lehman College, Dr. Mark Christian. And Dr. Mark, good to have you back.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Daren. It's nice to be here.
It's nice to have you here with us as well. Your work comes at a pivotal point in our history as we are now getting ready to see the nation begin to switch in the area of presidency. But one thing that still remains the same is racism, bigotry, and what we see right now, which is white nationalism and white supremacy. Talk to us a little bit about your book and what was the reason why you decided to write the book?
Well, you know, I've been teaching in higher education now for almost 30 years. I did my master's degree at Ohio State and in 92, 93. So I've been teaching around the area of Black studies for quite a long time now. The book has been in process for, I would say, about 2 years. I got a contract with Kendall Hunt to write the book, and they pushed me. Now, with this quarantine and the virus, I was able to have less distraction and able to focus on the book itself. So it's come out of my teaching. I dedicated it to the students I've taught over the past 28 years in higher education. And it's just a combination of those factors and the fact that I was able to spend some time writing rather than catching a virus.
Yeah. Talk to me about the 20th century. As you look at it, we talked about it here. Civil rights, of course, a major issue. That which people fought for seems to have been taken away. And we look now at a presidency. And now we could say the presidency of Donald Trump has come to an end. But during those years, some of the most treacherous years for America.
Yeah. When I look at the 20th century, I started with post-World War II, because that generation that fought during World War II came home to the United States with a little bit more optimism about what could happen to their lives and their communities, because they fought in a segregated army. The armed forces were not desegregated until 1948, which was 3 years after World War II. So in a sense, there was an impetus there with the desegregation of the armed services after World War II. And that generation, the likes of Medgar Evers came out of World War II and straight into Mississippi and the NAACP. And his activism was his cool calmness under pressure came from his experience of having served in World War II. So I emphasize the generation of World War II were fighting racism abroad, and they came home to fight racism at home. So the generation is very important from World War II of African Americans. Not sure you know this, but over 1 million African Americans, men and women, fought during World War II. And they were in tank battalions. There was a tank battalion called the 761st. And they weren't recognized. They weren't recognized in popular culture. They weren't recognized in documentaries until way, way past. So I emphasize that generation and everything they put into it. The discrimination they faced was profound because they came home still to a segregated society. And the Brown versus Board of Education from 1954, which brought down segregation in schools, was another impetus. The murders of George Reverend George Lee was shot in the face trying to get people registered in Mississippi. Young Emmett Till was lynched at age of 14, going again to Mississippi. All of that produced a movement, if you like, that ushered in Martin Luther King in 1955 and the Rosa Parks incident. What I say in this book as well, it's very important to note here, Daren, is that Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King are not the only participants. There were literally hundreds, thousands of people involved in the civil rights movement in breaking down segregation and discrimination throughout society. Important to note, and it's in the book, other individuals before Rosa Parks, Sarah Keyes fought against discrimination in travel.
Right, because when we look at Rosa Parks, we know that she was the one who was credited for sitting, in the front of the bus. But the reality is she wasn't the first. And when you talk about Dr. Martin Luther King, with no disrespect, because he is definitely one of my heroes, we look at what happened with King and the civil rights movement. But I remember it being said, Rosa Parks, the person who first was on the bus, wasn't probably the best to be the face of the movement. The same way Dr. King, in many ways, was considered the best face for the movement, even though there were other people who had had the movement going before him.
Correct. And what we need to know for our audience is that this has been a longevity of struggle. The civil rights movement of the 1950s didn't drop out of the sky. Like you said earlier, 19th century Reconstruction, all of that builds up to the 1950s. When Dr. King went to Washington in 1963, I've jumped ahead a little, but when he went for the March on Washington for jobs and freedom, he actually, the first part of that speech is about the indictment of America not fulfilling its promise of the 1963 Emancipation Proclamation. So he said we've come to redeem a bounced check, if you like. And then he goes into the I have a dream aspect, which was extemporaneous. He just spoke from his mind. And they've forgotten the actual critique he gave earlier in the speech about coming to the Lincoln Memorial for justice, for social justice, because it's been a bounced check. 100 years later, after the Emancipation Proclamation, we're still not free. So, you want to carry? So where am I? So 1963, the Brown versus Board of Education, World War II generation, all of these things are an impetus to the civil rights movement and the struggle that African Americans put their lives to. I was speaking to your colleague earlier about the 1965 struggle in Selma for voting rights. And we always see John Lewis, rightly so, as an icon of that particular experience. Well, he's not the only one again. I was thinking of George Floyd of last year being murdered. And a woman back in 1965, Amelia Boynton was her name then. She's now known as Amelia Boynton Robinson. She had a knee on her neck from a police officer as well, holding her down, and was beaten up. And she was in her mid-50s. And thankfully, she lived to over 100 years. But she's lost in history. And we've got to be always aware of the actors who get lost in history, because it was a movement, and charismatic leadership often overtakes the many hundreds of soldiers who are also putting their lives on the line for freedom. So John Lewis, great, wonderful human being, one of my heroes too, but there were also many other individuals, and I try to encapsulate that all within the book that I've produced.
Yeah. And in addition to talking about Dr. Martin Luther King, in addition to talking about Rosa Parks and those who were the civil rights, you also take time in really speaking to Malcolm X and the
I do.
fact, because, as a people, I think that America has always had to make a choice, Martin or Malcolm, either or. Are you on the side of Malcolm or are you on the side of Martin?
I don't know.
And, when you talk to those who have, lived in that generation, they said they were almost forced to make a choice sometimes, but there were some who said it's not either or, it's both and.
I agree. I agree entirely. In fact, I would say myself, I'm old enough to be a son of Malcolm and Martin. In fact, I would situate myself right in the center, Malcolm on my left, Martin on my right, or vice versa. I feel that those two thinkers and those two activists and those two men who did so much for the emancipation, if you like, of our minds and our bodies are yin and yang. They're not opposites. They're not either or. They are yin and yang and should be melded because both of them were coming together when they were assassinated. And it's important to know that Malcolm X is central to the civil rights era. He wasn't part of any civil rights movement organization. He was part of the Nation of Islam. So he gave a different voice. He was against nonviolence because he thought nonviolence was a weak strategy because the nature of all creatures on earth, humans and creatures, is to defend yourself when you're attacked. That's the nature, human nature. If I attacked you, Daren, you would naturally defend yourself. So the strategy of nonviolence was quite courageous. But for Malcolm X, it was not very intelligent because if somebody hits you, you should have the right to defend yourself. But Malcolm did not advocate violence for violence sake either. Malcolm was very, very against violence for violence sake, but he said quite clearly, quite strongly, that if somebody attacks you, you should have the right to defend yourself. And Black people, African Americans, were being attacked brutally by the police, by the KKK, by anybody who was against civil rights and their right to vote, their right to a decent education. They were fighting for was citizenship and to be treated equally. And this is what we have to understand. Yes, the media and many commentators have put us against our leaders. Oh, you should stay with Martin because Martin's about nonviolence. Keep away from Malcolm because Malcolm is a violent person. No, they were neither of them were against each other. They just had different strategies for gaining freedom for African Americans. And again, it's all in the book. Under a chapter on Malcolm X, his development as a person, because he had a very difficult childhood, his father was murdered by the KKK. His mother didn't receive her insurance policy that she was due because of institutionalized racism. The family disintegrates, and Malcolm is put in foster families. And the N-word is used so much for Malcolm as a kid in these white homes that he was put into, that he thought it was a pet name. So he as he developed, you've got to understand Malcolm's development as a child is far different than Dr. King's. Dr. King had a very comfortable childhood, a very loving home, 3 meals a day, good education. Malcolm is the opposite. His teacher puts him off education. He says, what do you want to be, Malcolm, when you grow up? And Malcolm says, well, sir, I'm thinking of being a lawyer. He was top of the class in his school. And the lawyer looks at him, Malcolm, that's not realistic for an N. You should think about doing something you can do, like carpentry. And that's what turned Malcolm off education. And he went into petty criminality and then got into prison And prison actually became a savior for young Malcolm. He was 21 years of age in prison. And then he began to read. And his brothers, not sure how many people know this, but his family were in the Nation of Islam before Malcolm. They introduced Malcolm into the Nation of Islam. His brother Reginald was very prominent in that sense. So you've got to look at Martin and Malcolm as they developed, and then you understand them much, much better. And then you can appreciate both of them, because we're in a world now where we need both Martin and Malcolm, and we always have. We always needed different perspectives that speak to the empowerment of Black people.
Absolutely. And when you talk about Martin and Malcolm, obviously there are two heroes that are considered for the civil rights movement during the time of the 60s, two people that are widely revered and still spoken about to this very present day. But I also want to talk about women, because there were very many women that were involved, not just in civil rights, but in the whole social justice movement. Talk to us, because in your book, and those that don't know, Dr. Mark Christian has his book, 20th Century Civil Rights, and talking about that, talking about the civil rights movement, talking about social justice, letting people know a little bit more about the history from whence African Americans, and not just Americans, but African Americans, but America has come. Talk to us a little bit about women, because women have played an integral part in this movement, and I know that you take the time to highlight 8 of them in your book.
Absolutely, and I could have highlighted 800.
Right.
The issue that we lose. I've dedicated a chapter actually to African American women leaders. So there's a whole chapter. There's 8 profiled, but then there's a discussion around women in general. And again, we can go right back into history and find many women who were amazing social justice advocates. One of my favorites is Ida B. Wells Barnett, who in the 19th century, she touched base with Frederick Douglass. She was a young lady who was a journalist, and she was based in Memphis, and she was writing about anti-lynching. Her printing press was destroyed, and she was chased out of town. She went to Liverpool, England, where I was born and raised, and fighting and protesting against anti-lynching. I'm saying this for longevity purposes. And you can go right through the decades and you will find many great women. Mary Church Terrell was another. Many women contributed to African American freedom. In fact, they've been the bedrock of organizations. Now, to fast forward to the civil rights movement, there are a number of women who are very important. You know, you can think of Ella Baker, Diane Nash, prominent organizers. Fannie Lou Hamer was a prominent organizer, but I left them out because I didn't profile them, because they are fairly well known now, thankfully. You know, but the likes of, have you ever heard of Joanne Robinson?
Yes, I have.
Joanne Gibson Robinson. Well, Joanne, she was essential to the Montgomery bus boycott. She's the one who printed up all the leaflets and got the Women's Political Council involved in the strike. She ran around, she was a teacher in Montgomery, Alabama. And so I profiled Joanne Robinson because Joanne Gibson Robinson. She never used Robinson back in the day, she used Gibson. They've all passed. She passed away in 1992, but they've left memoirs. And that's another thing I want to get into here. I've used the memoirs of those activists largely in the book. I've gone to their stories because they're the closest we have in my generation and the generations that will follow me. Those stories for me are the most authentic. You know, when we think of the women, we don't think of their memoirs. You know, there's Angela Davis. She wrote an autobiography. She's integral to the 1960s. Also, Mamie Phipps. Do you know her, Mamie Phipps? Well, Mamie Phipps Clark. She was the first to get a psychology degree from Columbia University in 1943. and her advisor was a staunch racist. So she married Kenneth Clark. I know you know Kenneth Clark
Mhm.
from Harlem, but those two, as a man and wife, they created the doll experiment that pushed forward the 1954 Board versus Education case. You know, you've heard of the doll test, where young black children were chosen to pick a white doll or a black doll, which is the best doll. And the majority of black children picked the white doll as the best doll, and the black doll was a bad doll. And so they showed clearly in their experimentation that the psychology of racism is deeply embedded in all of our minds as black individuals. And so that was a very powerful thing. Mammy Phipps Clark is largely hidden in history as well. So I profiled here also Amelia Boynton. She is also goes by Robinson later on. No connection to the other Robinson, Joanne Robinson. But Amelia was at the 1965 Voting Rights Act march in Selma, and she got beaten up, and she got a knee on her neck from police officers. You know, she was beaten up like George Floyd from May 25th, 2020, which will go down in history in our generation. So the past also leans into the present. So I can't emphasize the importance of women.
Yeah.
I've put many in there that will, and the chapter and the references will give the reader much more scope to study further and deeper than what I could go.
There's about 370 pages in your book,
Yes.
and it's a good long read. Talk to us about the pandemic, because you said the pandemic gave you some time to get this book, out and published. But talk to me about how hard was it for you to actually be able to concentrate, focus, and given the fact that when you're writing this book, we're in the middle of political unrest, we're in the middle of social unrest, and we're in the middle of re-heightened, racial tension.
For me personally, the quarantine was very good because I had less distraction. You can see the library behind me, my personal home library. I have a lot of books, and I can stay here and I can write, and it's been good, but it takes tremendous discipline to write from a blank screen and do your writing. You know, Maya Angelou said, easy writing is damn hard work. And I agree with her. And James Baldwin said, we write out of one thing only, our own experience, So all of it for me was in my mind, because I've experienced racism in Liverpool. Growing up as a child, I was chased by skinheads with chains. And if they had caught me, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you, Daren, today. I can still remember I was 12 years of age in Liverpool in the 1970s. And I was being chased for my life. And I got away by the grace of God. But that keeps in your mind and propels you to write about race and racism, because it's such an ugly thing. You mentioned earlier also about white nationalism. Right. People often get this, they think white nationalism, black nationalism, same thing, different. Bit like, and I have a real problem with that. And I've explained it again in the book. The book explains this difference between white nationalism and black nationalism. The difference between the two, in short, white nationalism has endeavored to conquer people, has endeavored to dehumanize people, has endeavored to take the land from people, has endeavored to take away their humanity, has endeavored to hurt and maim and lynch and kill African Americans and people of color globally. Segregation. All of these things, their popular culture has tried to destroy the humanity of people of color. Now, this is all part and parcel of white nationalism. If you turn the leaf and look at black nationalism, fundamentally, black nationalism is about doing for self, creating economic prosperity in your own community, developing a sense of self that allows you to express your humanity, have an education that speaks to your history positively, and you're not a social problem anymore. You know, black nationalism is about taking care of the politics in your community and having a voice, not about violence. Show me somewhere where black people have organized to go and take the land of people, kill people, have lynching parties. Show me that in black nationalism. Black nationalism has only been distorted, just like black power. Martin Luther King didn't like the phrase black power, but he liked the underlining element of black power, which was to have economic power, political power, social power in order to deal with the deep discrimination in the broader society. If black people could spread their dollar around each other a little bit more, even today, a lot of the social problems would disappear. So, but black nationalism has never been about hurting white people. It's been about uplifting black people.
So we got to leave it there, Dr. Christian, but I want to ask you real quickly before we go, where can people tap into your book?
This book is available via Kendall Hunt website. So just tap in Kendall Hunt, and the title, The 20th Century Civil Rights Movement, an Africana Studies Perspective. Can I just finish on this?
I'm out of time. So I gotta bring it. That means I gotta bring it back. That's all.
We're going to talk again, Daren. It's always good to speak to you.
Always good to talk to you too, Dr. Mark Christian, Chair of Africana Studies, Lehman College. Thank you so much for being with us. His book is 20th Century Civil Rights Movement. We encourage you to get it and find out more about it. Got to take a quick break here on the Social Justice Forums. We got our history lesson. Now we're going to talk even further in depth coming up after this break.